bury this girl in an extraordinary place. Now a team of investigators will attempt to decipher these objects, examine her body, and unravel the mysteries of this mummy.
Something has been sitting inside a glass case in northern Argentina for years now. And once you understand what actually happened to her, you may never hear the word discovery the same way again. She was 13. Her mouth was stuffed with coca leaves, and her stomach was full of terror. The science that finally cracked open her story is somehow worse than the silence that came before it. What we just learned in the past few months. Just a few months back, in the middle of this year, a team of researchers led by Dagmara Sieczkowska-Jasina published a fresh study in the journal Archaeometry, and what they did was quietly explosive. They took the girl the world calls the Maiden, and they radiocarbon dated her again with far more precision than anyone had ever attempted. The result narrowed her death to somewhere between the year 1462 and the year 1507. That window is not a random number to me. It lines up almost perfectly with the reigns of two of the most ruthless emperors the Inca ever produced, Topa Inca Yupanqui and his son, Huayna Capac. That timing matters because for years the popular explanation was that these children were offered up because of some natural disaster, a drought, a volcano, some kind of sky anger the Inca were trying to calm down. This new study looked at the climate records and quietly ruled all of that out. There was no eruption. There was no famine. There was no crisis in the heavens. What there was, according to the authors, was a very deliberate act of statecraft. They wrote, and I want you to hear this word for word, that the Capacocha ritual might have been used as part of the broader Inca statecraft. In plain speech, this child was not sent to die because the gods demanded it. She was sent to die because an emperor needed a message delivered to the far southern edge of his empire, and her body was the letter. Then, just this February, another discovery pushed this story even further. Archaeologist Dagmara Socha and explorer Johann Reinhard, the same Reinhard who helped uncover the famous Lulailako children in 1999, published a groundbreaking study based on new CT scans of 4 frozen children recovered from Peru's Ambato and Sarasara volcanoes.
Leading the team was explorer and anthropologist Dr. Johann Reinhard.
Their findings challenge one of the most deeply rooted beliefs about the Inca Capacocha ritual. Every one of the 4 children examined showed evidence of fatal blunt force trauma to the head. Every single one. For years, many historians believed these children quietly drifted to sleep after drinking chicha or chewing coca leaves before freezing peacefully on sacred mountaintop. The scans tell a far more unsettling story. At least in these cases, death came through deliberate violence before the bodies were placed on the mountains. One child revealed something even more remarkable. The CT scans showed that the body had been intentionally mummified after death and then transported to another location before being buried. That is the first clear evidence of this process in a known Capacocha victim. It means the ritual did not necessarily end where the child died. Instead, officials carefully preserved the body, carried it across the empire, and conducted a second ceremonial burial elsewhere. This was not a simple mountain offering. It points to an organized imperial system involving priests, officials, porters, and carefully planned ceremonial journeys. Socha also urged historians to rethink the Spanish colonial accounts that have shaped our understanding for centuries. Those chroniclers described the selected children as flawless, perfectly healthy, and physically pure. Modern science tells a different story. CT scans reveal evidence of diseases such as Chagas, possible signs of tuberculosis, and intentional cranial reshaping performed during infancy to reflect social status. These children were not chosen because they were physically perfect. They were selected because they fulfilled the political, religious, and symbolic needs of the Inca Empire at that particular moment. And that is why we want to walk you all the way back to the day the world first met the Maiden. because everything you are about to hear about her happens in the shadow of what we now know was waiting for her at the top of that volcano. The day they found her. The date was the 16th of March, 1999. The place was Volcan Ilico, a stratovolcano so remote it sits on the seam between Argentina and Chile, in a stretch of desert so dry that NASA has literally used it to test equipment meant for Mars. The summit rises to 22,110 feet. To give you a sense of what that means to a human body, the oxygen up there is roughly half of what your lungs are used to right now. Men have been known to lie down at that altitude, close their eyes, and simply not wake up. Johann Reinhard and Constanza Cerruti had been climbing that mountain for almost a month. According to Cerruti's own writing in the Journal of Sustainability Education, she was enduring the cold and the extreme altitude every single day of that dig. They were exhausted. They were running out of time. Reinhard has said in his own interviews that the team was preparing to give up and abandon the search when a researcher noticed a layer of earth that looked wrong, not natural, not the way wind and time lay soil down. Someone, centuries earlier, had disturbed that ground on purpose. They started digging, about 5 feet down through frozen, packed earth. Someone in the team let out a shout that Reinhard will probably carry to his grave. Mummy, that single word, in that thin air, on top of the highest archaeological site ever found on this planet. The first thing they pulled out was a bundle of textiles so pristine the colors of the wool looked freshly dyed. Reinhard has said on record that he was afraid to breathe near her. His whole team started communicating in whispers, moving slowly, almost tiptoeing around the site. He described the feeling as being afraid at some level that they might wake her up. And the reason for that reverence became obvious when they finally peeled back the wrappings on her hands. Reinhard called that one of the most powerful experiences of his life. Not because of what he found, because of what he did not find. There was no decomposition. There were no bone-dry fingers. There were tiny individual hairs still standing up on her forearm. The fingernails were intact. The skin held its color. But it was the third body that broke him. Buried near the maiden was a girl the archaeologists would later name the Lightning Girl. And when Reinhard drew back her headcloth, he found himself staring straight into a child's face. Not a skull, not a shrunken mask. A face, he described it, in his own essay for the Penn Museum, as a pensive stare. A 5-year-old girl looking back at him after 5 centuries, with the same expression she had worn the moment she was buried alive. That excavation eventually pulled up 3 children and more than 100 artifacts, tiny figurines of humans and llamas made of gold and silver and spondylus shell, feathered headdresses, food bags, cloth so well preserved it could still be dyed by touch. The team had walked into what is arguably the single most important archaeological find in the Americas in the last century. And yet, for all the celebration around the discovery, the real horror was not in what they had found. It was in what those 3 little bodies were about to tell us once the scientists back at sea level got their hands on the data. 3 children with 3 very different endings. The 3 of them did not die the same way. That is something I feel gets buried in the retellings, and it should not, because their endings are the whole story. What happened to each of them tells us something different, and something specific about how the Inca state used children as tools. The maiden was the oldest of the 3. She was around 13 years old at the time of her death, and when the team looked at her, she looked like she was sleeping. Head tilted forward, legs crossed, arms resting easily in her lap. She was still wearing her feathered headdress and a kumbai tunic draped over her right shoulder, and her hair had been braided into dozens of tight, careful braids just before she died. There was a chewed wad of coca leaves still sitting in her cheek. Her offerings around her had never been disturbed. If you did not know better, you would say she had chosen this. She had settled into her position, closed her eyes, and let the cold take her. The Lightning Girl was about 6 years old. Some newer scans place her closer to 4. She was found with her legs bent and crossed underneath her, hands resting on her thighs, hair in tidy braids, wearing a wrap dress with a multicolored sash and a silver metal ornament pressed to her forehead. By all the evidence around her body, she also died peacefully. She was sedated, she was placed, and she went to sleep. But something happened to her after she was buried that unsettles even the scientists who have handled her. At some point in the last 500 years, a bolt of lightning struck the mountain directly above her tomb. That bolt penetrated more than a meter through packed frozen earth, punched through her wrappings, and burned a cavity into her chest and part of her face. And yet, somehow, her heart, her brain, and her internal organs remained perfectly preserved. She was, in a strange and awful way, marked twice, once by her own people and once by the sky. Then there is the boy, and the boy is where the story turns from sad to sickening. He was around 7 years old, though some estimates put him younger. His skull had been intentionally elongated in infancy, a mark of status among certain Andean groups. He was dressed in a red tunic and leather moccasins, with a silver bracelet on his right forearm and a white feather headdress held in place by a woolen sling. That should have made him look regal. It made him look like the others, but the moment researchers looked at him closely, the illusion of peace collapsed. His legs had been tied. His body had been wrapped so tightly with rope that his ribs were cracked and displaced. His pelvis was dislocated. There was blood on his clothing. There was vomit on his clothing. He had head lice. Whatever had been done to him at the top of that mountain, it had not been quiet, and it had not been gentle. The scientists began to whisper that the maiden and the Lightning Girl might have been sedated into oblivion, but the boy had been fighting something, fighting someone. And when the first genetic tests came back, they revealed one final detail that adds a chill to everything. The 3 of them were not siblings. They were not cousins. Their mitochondrial DNA showed they came from completely different maternal lines. 3 children from 3 different families drawn together for one single purpose on the roof of the empire. What the chroniclers never told us to understand. Why an emperor would send 3 unrelated children to freeze on a mountain, we have to talk about a ritual the Inca called capacocha. The word itself translates roughly as royal obligation or noble sacrifice. And the way the Spanish priests described it, after they came in and tore the empire apart in the 1530s, sounded almost religious, almost respectable. Cristobal de Molina, a chronicler who spoke Quechua and interviewed native informants, gave us the most complete description we have. He wrote that when a new emperor took the throne, or when the emperor fell sick, or when he died, the provinces of the empire were required to send their most beautiful children to Cusco. There, in the capital, the children were feasted. They were dressed in the finest textiles. They were sometimes paired into ceremonial couples. Then they were marched out along the vast Inca road system, on foot, to their assigned mountain shrines, where they would be killed and buried with gold and silver figurines as offerings to the gods and to the emperor. Bernabe Cobo, writing his massive history of the New World in the 1650s, went further. He described the different methods. Some children were strangled, some were struck in the head, some were buried alive after being intoxicated with chicha, the fermented maize beer brewed by a special class of women called the Aquelas, the chosen ones. Cobo wrote that these girls were dedicated to the sun and to the Inca, and that to violate them was to rob the empire. Juan de Betanzos claimed that when an emperor died, as many as 1,000 children could be sacrificed at once. Bartolomé Alvarez added a detail that everyone glosses over. He wrote that girls who did not wish to die were sedated or intoxicated, and then sacrificed anyway. For centuries, historians read all of this and treated it like the story of an ancient religion. Not comfortable, but coherent. The children were honored. The children were chosen. The children became guardian deities protecting their communities from beyond the grave. There is even a famous account of a girl named Tanta Karhua, walled up alive at the age of 10, who reportedly told her captors that they could finish with her now because she could not be more honored than she had already been in Cusco. The mountain children were supposed to fit that story. They were supposed to be physically perfect, unblemished by even a freckle or a scar, innocent, willing, divine. And yet, that fresh Peruvian study from earlier this year, the one from Socha and Reinhard, blew that entire framework apart. Those 4 children from Ampato and Sara were not unblemished. They had a disease in their bones. One of them had signs of Chagas. Others showed possible tuberculosis. One of them, as I mentioned earlier, had been mummified after death and physically relocated. The chroniclers had been telling us for 5 centuries that the Inca were selecting angels for slaughter. The bones are telling us the Inca were selecting whoever was politically useful and dressing them up as angels afterward. Which brings us back to the maiden. Because if the ritual was not really about purity, and if the mountain was not really weeping for a drought, then the question of what actually killed her stops being a religious question. It becomes a chemistry question. And in the year 2013, a bioarchaeologist in England finally cracked open her hair to answer it. The study that changed everything. The scientist was Andrew Wilson from the University of Bradford in the United Kingdom. And what he did was so clever it almost hurts. He took strands of the maiden's hair, which had been perfectly preserved by the ice, and he ran them through liquid chromatography and mass spectrometry, segment by segment. Human hair grows at roughly 1 centimeter a month.
And her hair, it turns out, hair grows roughly 1 centimeter per month. And once it grows,
that means every centimeter of her long braid was, in effect, a monthly diary of every chemical she had put into her body in the final 2 years of her life. Wilson was not looking at a mummy. He was looking at a timeline. What he found is the reason this story exists at all. For the last 12 months of her life, the maiden's hair showed steadily increasing levels of a chemical called benzoylecgonine. Benzoylecgonine is the metabolite your body creates when it processes cocaine. In her case, that cocaine was coming from the coca leaf, which had been sacred in the Andes for thousands of years. But the concentration in her hair was not sacred level use. It was staggering. Wilson's paper, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in the year 2013, reported that her benzoylecgonine reading was around 3.5 times higher than any previously analyzed South American mummy, higher than shamans, higher than warriors, higher than any adult ever tested. And it did not stop there. Her hair also carried alcohol markers, specifically a compound called coca-ethylene, which forms in the body when coca and alcohol are consumed together. Her coca-ethylene level in the final weeks of her life spiked from a baseline of less than 1 nanogram per milligram of hair to more than 8. She was being loaded up, systematically, predictably. Someone was managing her intake. Wilson gave an interview after the study came out, and he said something that has stayed with me for years. He said that by the time she died, she was probably heavily sedated. That is a clinical way of saying that this child was walking or being carried up a 22,000-foot mountain in a chemical haze she could not have chosen for herself. He also said, and this part I want you to sit with in the honest sense of that phrase, that this is not a desiccated mummy. This is not a set of bones. This is a person. This is a child. He said it was almost like the children were able to reach out and tell us their own stories. The study also revealed a smaller peak in her coca use about 6 months before her death, and that peak lines up perfectly with a physical artifact found in her tomb. Someone had cut her hair around that time. The cut hair was bagged and buried with her. The researchers believe that 6-month mark corresponds to the moment she was officially selected for the ritual in Cusco. The ceremony began. The clock started, and from that moment forward, she was slowly, methodically, chemically walked toward the top of a volcano. You can call it religion if you want. Andrew Wilson's colleague Timothy Taylor did not. Taylor described her death as grim, and he said something that changes the entire tone of this story. He said we should not forget that the Inca were imperialists, and that the treatment of children like this may have served to instill fear and facilitate social control over remote mountain areas. Fear, control, that is not a prayer, that is a policy. And if fear was the point, then whatever they did to the boy makes a horrible kind of sense. The boy nobody wants to talk about. The boy is the child the documentaries tend to skip past quickly, because his body carries evidence that most people do not want to sit with, and I understand the instinct. I do. But if we are being honest about what the Inca Capacocha actually was, then we owe him at least a chapter. Let me lay out what the radiologists and forensic teams have actually documented on his body. His legs were bound, not draped in cloth, tied. His entire body was then wrapped with rope so tightly that when scientists ran him through the same imaging equipment used on modern trauma victims, they found his ribs had been cracked and displaced by the pressure. His pelvis was dislocated. There was blood staining the fibers of his tunic, and there was vomit staining the front of his clothing near his mouth. There was also a woolen sling around his head, and this is the detail I keep coming back to. In Andean tradition, slings were sometimes used ritually to launch stones into sacred lagoons to summon rain. But a sling wrapped around a small boy's face is not a ceremonial object. Some researchers have suggested that the sling may have been used to muffle him, to silence him. Others have suggested it was pulled over his head as part of an asphyxiation. The peer-reviewed team behind the 2013 PNAS study wrote that there was an apparent absence of evidence for direct violence at Lula'ilaco, and I want to be fair to that finding. They were being cautious in scientific language, but the same paper acknowledges the boy was very likely suffocated, and the physical damage to his body speaks for itself. A 4 to 7-year-old child does not end up with cracked ribs.
They also found 2 younger children, a 7-year-old boy and a girl around the same age,
and a dislocated pelvis and blood on his shirt because he peacefully drifted off in his sleep. Something was done to him. Someone did it. And they did it up there, in that thin, cold air, on the top of the world. Constanza Cerruti has proposed a slightly gentler interpretation. She has suggested that the boy may have died of high-altitude pulmonary edema, a condition where fluid fills the lungs, causing vomiting and eventually death. That is possible. It is a real medical phenomenon at that elevation, but it does not explain the binding. It does not explain why his body was tied down before he had even stopped moving. And it does not explain the difference between his ending and the maiden's ending, because that is the thing that unsettles me the most. If Capacocha was truly a religious honor, if these children were truly walking angels, why did their deaths look so different from each other? Why did the girls get to fall asleep and the boy get bound? Why did the girls get their coca leaves and their careful braids and the boy get his ribs broken? That inconsistency is not the mark of a spiritual ceremony. That is the mark of an execution system, where some victims cooperated and some did not. Timothy Taylor and other researchers have suggested that boys and girls may have played different symbolic roles in the ritual. Girls, the Axielas, were often sedated as future brides of the sun. Boys, particularly boys of high status, may have been sacrificed in ways that mirrored the way the Inca dealt with enemies of the state: bound, silenced, broken. If that reading is right, and I think there is a strong case that it is, then what happened on top of Volcan Lula'ilaco 500 years ago was not a ritual death at all. It was 3 killings, at 3 different tempos, for 3 different political messages, and every single one of them was aimed at anyone in that empire who might have thought about crossing Cusco. Which is why the debate about what happens to their bodies today is not just about archaeology. It is about who gets to speak for them now. Behind the glass, in Salta, today the 3 Lula'ilaco children reside, if that word can even be used, inside the Museo de Arqueología de Alta Montaña, or Museum of High Altitude Archaeology, in Salta, northern Argentina. The museum opened in 2004 and began exhibiting the mummies to the public in 2007. Because of their extraordinary state of preservation, only one child is displayed at any given time. The other two remain inside highly specialized cryopreservation chambers that recreate the conditions at the summit of Llulailaco. Temperatures of around -20 degrees Celsius, extremely low oxygen levels, carefully controlled humidity, and filtered ultraviolet light. These systems are designed to slow deterioration and preserve the bodies for future generations. The child on display rests inside a transparent glass case, softly illuminated in an otherwise quiet gallery. Every year, thousands of visitors file past, marveling at a face that appears almost peacefully asleep, despite having remained frozen for more than 5 centuries. The museum has earned international recognition and is consistently ranked among Argentina's most celebrated cultural attractions. But to many indigenous communities, that praise feels deeply painful. For descendants of the Cola and Quechua peoples, Llulailaco is not simply an archaeological site. It remains a sacred mountain, and the children are not museum artifacts. They are ancestors whose final resting place should never have been disturbed. Rogelio Guanuco, speaking on behalf of the Indigenous Association of Argentina, expressed that view with striking clarity. He said, Llulailaco continues to be holy ground for his people, and argued that the mountain should never have been violated in the first place. Then he added words that continue to fuel the debate today. The museum should not put our children on exhibition as if in a circus. Circus. That is the word he chose. And once you have heard it, you cannot unhear it, because it lands. An indigenous forum held in Salta in the year 2005 had already demanded that the bodies be returned to the mountain. They denounced what they called the so-called exhibition of these children, human beings with the right to rest in peace. They accused the scientific community of treating their sacred heritages as mere objects of study. And in the year 2022, after the Argentine government's National Institute of Indigenous Affairs formally declared Llulailaco a sacred site, those calls for repatriation rose again. The counter-argument is not without weight, and I want to be fair to it. Critics of returning the bodies to the summit, including certain Argentine journalists, have warned that a public reburial on the mountain would essentially be an invitation for looters. There are stories, some documented, some rumored, of high-altitude tomb robbers making off with mummies for private collectors long before the archaeologists arrive. The scientific community argues that the museum, cold and controlled and protected, may be the only thing standing between these children and the black market. And that is the moral knot that this story ends on. On one side, 3 children who were killed by their own state, kidnapped again by a foreign science, and now displayed for ticket buyers. On the other side, the honest fear that if you send them home, someone else will steal them all over again. I do not have a clean answer for you. I do not think anyone does. What I have is the weight of knowing that the mystery, the one that everybody spent decades trying to solve, is not really a mystery anymore. We know what the coca did to her body. We know what the rope did to his ribs. We know what the lightning did to her face. We know the emperor's calendar. We know the political motive. The mystery that remains is not archaeological. It is moral. It is what a modern world does with a 500-year-old crime scene.
For 500 years, the Inca maiden has guarded the secrets of how she died.
When the victims cannot speak, and their descendants are the only ones still willing to fight for them. That is the story as we now understand it, and honestly, I am still turning it over in my head. Drop your thoughts in the comments and tell me whether you think those 3 children belong back on that mountain, because I genuinely want to hear where you land on this one.